The economic disaster of the Balkans did not begin with modern governments, recent wars, or bad policies. It began centuries ago, when the region was transformed into a permanent geopolitical battlefield rather than a place allowed to develop stable institutions. Because while Western Europe slowly built wealth through trade, private property, and legal continuity, the Balkans were repeatedly conquered, divided, and ruled by foreign empires that extracted taxes, labor, and resources without investing in long-term economic foundations, starting with the Ottoman Empire, which controlled large parts of the region for hundreds of years and governed it not as an economic engine but as a frontier zone, where loyalty mattered more than productivity, where land ownership was uncertain, and where modern banking, entrepreneurship, and industrialization were delayed while Western Europe was already moving toward capitalism. And when Ottoman rule weakened, the Balkans did not transition smoothly into independent, institutionally strong states, but instead became fragmented territories fought over by rival powers like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and later European nation-states, each redrawing borders based on political interests rather than economic logic, creating countries with mixed populations, unresolved ethnic tensions, and governments that lacked legitimacy in the eyes of their own people, which meant that trust, one of the most critical ingredients of economic growth, never fully formed, because when people do not trust the state, they avoid paying taxes, avoid long-term investment, and focus on short-term survival. And this survival mentality became deeply embedded in Balkan societies over generations, reinforced by frequent wars, forced migrations, and political instability that constantly wiped out savings, destroyed infrastructure, and reset progress back to zero, teaching people that building wealth was risky because it could disappear overnight. And unlike countries that experienced stable centuries of gradual growth, the Balkans experienced repeated economic interruptions that prevented the accumulation of capital, knowledge, and institutional memory, meaning that each generation was forced to start over rather than build upon the success of the previous one. And this historical instability also shaped governance, because rulers, whether imperial administrators or later national elites, focused on control rather than development, prioritizing military security, political loyalty, and ethnic dominance over economic efficiency, innovation, or merit-based systems which normalize corruption and favoritism as tools of governance rather than exceptions. And when the modern era arrived and capitalism became the global economic system, the Balkans entered it at a severe disadvantage, lacking strong property rights, independent courts, reliable financial systems, and a culture of long-term investment, all of which are invisible but essential foundations of prosperity. And while Western Europe benefited from centuries of institutional continuity that allowed businesses to plan decades ahead, the Balkans remained stuck in a cycle where political change constantly rewrote economic rules, discouraging both domestic and foreign investors. And even when periods of relative peace emerged, they were often too short to undo the damage caused by previous conflicts, because rebuilding trust in institutions takes far longer than destroying them. And this long history of instability also shaped social behavior, as communities learned to rely more on family networks, informal economies, and personal connections rather than formal systems, which helped people survive but weakened the development of transparent markets and competitive business environments. And over time, this created a paradox where individuals became highly adaptable and resilient. Yet the overall economy remained fragile and inefficient, because systems designed for survival are not designed for growth. And by the time the 20th century arrived, the Balkans were already economically behind Western Europe. Not because of lack of intelligence or effort, but because history had systematically the region from developing the same institutional advantages. And when nationalism rose and empires collapsed, instead of economic consolidation, the Balkans experienced further fragmentation, as newly formed states prioritized identity and sovereignty over economic integration, leading to small markets, duplicated bureaucracies, and constant political tension, all of which increased costs and reduced competitiveness. And this historical pattern explains why later economic shocks, such as the collapse of Yugoslavia, were so devastating, because the region did not have strong buffers to absorb them, and why recovery has been so slow, because the roots of the problem go far deeper than any single policy, failure or corrupt government, extending into centuries of disrupted development, broken trust and institutional weakness that still shape economic behavior today, making the Balkan crisis not a temporary setback but the long-term outcome of a history that repeatedly punished stability and rewarded short-term survival, trapping the region in an economic position where progress is possible but fragile, growth exists but is uneven, and prosperity always feels just out of reach, as if history itself keeps pulling the Balkans back whenever they try to move forward. While Western Europe was slowly laying the foundations of modern prosperity through private property rights, commercial law, banking systems, and early industrialization, the Balkans were trapped under imperial systems that viewed the region not as a place to be developed, but as a territory to be controlled, taxed, and strategically managed, beginning with the Ottoman Empire, which ruled much of the Balkans for centuries and structured its economy around agricultural extraction, military administration, and political loyalty rather than productivity, innovation, or market efficiency, meaning that land was often held under unclear ownership arrangements. Long-term investment was discouraged, and economic activity focused on meeting imperial demands instead of building local wealth, and while the Ottomans maintained order for long periods, they did not create the kind of legal and financial institutions that later powered Western Europe's economic rise, such as independent courts, merchant protections, or capital markets, leaving the Balkans economically stagnant at a time when countries like England, France, and the Netherlands were already accumulating capital, expanding trade networks, and experimenting with early forms of capitalism, and when Ottoman power began to weaken, the region did not transition smoothly into modern nation-states with coherent economic strategies, but instead became the object of competition between rival empires, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which controlled parts of the Balkans but integrated them primarily to serve Vienna and Budapest rather than local development, investing selectively in infrastructure that benefited imperial administration while leaving many areas underdeveloped, reinforcing economic inequality within the region and creating fragmented systems where some cities were modestly modernized while rural and peripheral areas remained trapped in poverty, and this uneven development deepened social divisions and prevented the formation of unified national markets because economies thrive on scale, integration, and consistency, none of which the Balkans were allowed to achieve under imperial rule, and as borders shifted repeatedly based on diplomatic deals and wars rather than economic logic, communities were split, trade routes were disrupted, and businesses were forced to adapt to new laws, currencies, and authorities every few decades, making long-term planning nearly impossible. And this constant restructuring taught economic actors to prioritize short-term gains and personal connections over institutional trust, because relying on the state was risky when the state itself could disappear or change overnight. And unlike Western Europe, where institutional continuity allowed wealth, skills, and capital to compound over generations, the Balkans experienced repeated resets that erased progress and discouraged the accumulation of economic knowledge. And when nationalism surged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newly emerging Balkan states inherited this broken institutional legacy, but instead of focusing on economic integration and reform, many prioritized identity building, military readiness, and political survival in a hostile environment, diverting resources away from education, industrial policy, and infrastructure. And because these states were small, divided, and often in conflict with one another, they lacked the internal markets and political stability necessary to attract large-scale investment. While Western Europe was already benefiting from integrated economies and expanding global trade, and even when moments of opportunity arose, such as independence or temporary peace, the absence of deep-rooted institutions meant that progress depended heavily on individual leaders rather than systems, making growth fragile and easily reversible. And over time, this historical pattern created a structural gap between the Balkans and Western Europe, not because Balkan societies were incapable of development, but because they were systematically denied the conditions required for sustained economic growth, and this gap widened further as industrialization accelerated elsewhere, leaving the Balkans increasingly behind in productivity, technology, and capital accumulation. And by the time the modern global economy emerged in the 20th century, He region entered it burdened by centuries of underinvestment, fragmented governance, and economic structures designed for extraction rather than innovation, all of which shaped how later systems, from socialism to post-communist capitalism, would function. Because institutions do not appear overnight, and when they are missing, every new economic model is forced to operate on unstable foundations, explaining why even well-intentioned reforms repeatedly failed to deliver lasting prosperity, and why the legacy of empire in the Balkans is not just visible in borders or architecture, but deeply embedded in economic behavior, governance, and expectations, creating a region that has always been connected to Europe politically and geographically, yet left behind economically, carrying the invisible scars of empires that took what they needed and moved on, leaving societies to rebuild again and again without the tools required to finally break the cycle.